Silent Hill 2 Remake is not perfect, just like the original, and that's exactly why it's almost a perfect remake. When Konami announced they would be remaking Silent Hill 2 in partnership with Polish studio Bloober Team, people were rightfully so skeptical. Not really because of Bloober's uneven track record or even Konami's unconvincing approach to the series for decades. No, it made sense to be skeptical because the original Silent Hill 2 was simply considered one of those untouchable masterpieces, so perfect even in its imperfections that it would be impossible to remake well. And yet, Bloober Team did it, and I want to explore how. Little disclaimer, there will be some light spoilers on characters and places, but I will try to avoid going too much into the game's big twist, but really, if you don't know it yet, play the game or watch a playthrough or something. Released in 2001 on PlayStation 2, the original Silent Hill 2 is psychological horror at its finest, and remembered for many things. One of the most impactful and mature stories of video game history, an art direction that overturned and invented many of the standards of the horror genre, some of the most iconic monsters ever designed, memorable characters and fates made possible only thanks to amazing care given to the writing and the translation, and an overall experience that would leave a lifelong impact on anyone witnessing the tragedy behind James Sunderland's descent into Silent Hill. How could we remake this PlayStation 2 game in modern standards without losing what made the original so powerful? Some people who totally lost sight of what the original game really was about, and I see way too many of those, will tell you otherwise. But being myself a fan of the game since its initial release, having been through multiple playthroughs, including one the week before the release of the remake, and having for decades cherished the experience the original Team Silent came up with, I can tell you, Bloober Team accomplished a feat we haven't quite grasped yet. They kept what was essential to keep. They translated an atmosphere that was barely describable in the first place. They modernized very effectively archaic mechanisms from the original without losing touch with the sensations we felt more than 20 years ago. They added sections that were definitely missing from the original game and would have probably been developed should the technology have allowed it back then. And it found the courage to overturn our expectations about very iconic moments of the game in a very smart and respectful way. Is Silent Hill 2 Remake a perfect game? No. Neither was the original, by the way. It was far from perfect. The gameplay and combats were stiff and clunky, the voice acting weird, the writing confusing and probably discouraging to some players. But it is precisely those imperfections that made the original game so memorable and powerful, and so in line with the message and feelings it was trying to convey. The eerie, off-putting dialogues made no sense for the most part until we realized the secrets hidden behind James' return to Silent Hill. It's a game that required commitment, patience, and an open mind. A mind willing to welcome the craziness of what it was witnessing. A mind willing to thread on the thin line between reality and dream, or nightmare. The gameplay consciously played with this. 1 minute we can jump in a series of bottomless holes unscathed. The next, James actually receives damages during a cutscene when he gets thrown off the roof by Pyramid Head. Eddie and James can take dozens of bullets during their fights, but if you even graze Maria's shoulder with your handgun, it's game over. To me, it was the first horror game I committed to completely, spending entire nights exploring every corner and uncovering all the endings. Trying to make sense of things, feeling as confused, frustrated, and sometimes desperate as the character I played. And it was exactly this that allowed the game to fully convey the horror we were playing a part of. And just like the original, the imperfections we can find in the remake are actually part of what makes this game not only an excellent horror game, but also a very good remake. One of the main criticisms I've read about Silent Hill 2 Remake, from people familiar with the original or not, has to do with the pacing. The game takes too long to complete, there are too many moments dragging on. Why would I complete a remake taking 16 hours when the original literally took half that amount of time for one playthrough? But Silent Hill 2 is all about enduring time, even if it's painful. Thematically, the perception of time as long, confusing, and tedious is central to the game and its premises. The long 3 years of Mary's decease, and James' confusion as to whether she died 3 years ago or not. The long, gradual descent into despair, not only for James, but also for Eddie and Angela, who, by the way, endured years of abuse, and who we see falling into madness as we slowly progress through the town of Silent Hill. In the original game, some segments are all about waiting, desperately, that things come to an end. There is nothing you can do in the first fight with Pyramid Head except waiting. Moving around the town often consisted in running or backtracking through empty streets to recover the one item that could allow you to reach another area you're not even sure why you need to reach in the first place. To make things longer than they should was something desired by Team Silent. The first 10 minutes or so of the game just consisted in James walking, or at best jogging, through the forest, into the town, and when we reach it, we see a shadow, and then we have to keep walking and following something we haven't quite identified until finally hell breaks loose. Silent Hill 2 Remake not only chose to keep those extremely slow moments, but added some of them when it made actually a lot of sense. In an age when AAA games start with action-packed and super dynamic intros, here we still spend the first 10 minutes of the game walking. And even after that, exploring the rest of the town takes more time than in the original because things are more explorable, and although for the most part empty, we see it was a town that used to live, and this marks a contrast with James' experience and isolation. The hospital area not only takes longer to complete, but it is also visually designed in order to make us feel the passing of time strongly. As developers themselves have mentioned, a lot of care was given to light effects in this area when we first enter it, not only making the place beautiful, but also making the transition into nighttime much more noticeable and impactful for the players. Personally, I thought I had entered the other world, which made things more frightening and confusing. The labyrinth is also an excellent example. It is way too long, it's tedious. As it should, it's a freaking labyrinth. It's spatially confusing, we systematically second guess where we should go, and we're not given a lot of signals as to how our actions actually make James progress in this maze. And when in the middle of this they add a totally unexpected confrontation, monsters, and rooms, even if you're extremely familiar with the original game, you lose a sense of what you know, what you can expect, and how you can move forward. This is exactly the feeling that we should get in such an environment, and the remake does that better than in the original. Is it a perfect gaming experience in terms of pace and rhythm in today's standards? No, but it's the closest Bloober Team could get to recreate the unique atmosphere that the original game conveyed, and to really put players into James' shoes, and that was probably one of the biggest challenges in remaking this game. The writing of Silent Hill 2 Remake was also something extremely tricky to approach, and also got its fair share of criticism. In the original, the writing and its English translation were simply mind-blowing in how beautiful, confusing, and effective at the same time they were. We only start to realize this during our first playthrough towards the end of the game, as we explore the Lakeview Hotel. The subtle hints we get until the final revelation is given. How the player uncovers the truth pretty much at the same time as our protagonist. And that's when we really understand how everything that we thought was, weird Japanese fetishist horror was actually so much more. That's when the true psychological dimension of Silent Hill 2 can be seen. That's also why we, as players, end up emphasizing so much with James and his fate, even though we shouldn't. If we paid attention, we realized that every dialogue up until now, every memo, every site, every inscription and room, every enemy we discovered actually had a hidden meaning, and revealed more about the character we were playing than the town of Silent Hill itself. We realize how the role of side characters like Angela and Eddie is much more than simple narrative devices to make James progress through the town, but actually mirrors James should have looked into to realize where he was heading. This in turn justifies the game's replayability, and that's exactly why 4 main endings were designed from the get-go. It is a nightmare that we need to revisit to fully grasp its implications. It's a game that we need to think about in order to fully understand why we feel what we feel when playing it. So I'll admit, I was a bit concerned about the writing in this remake. In my experience, the writing often turns out too straightforward and made more accessible, even if it undermines the story being told. I've seen that in fairly simple stories like Secret of Mana Remake. And in the case of Silent Hill 2, we're talking about complex, beautiful story. So I was relieved that Bloober's Silent Hill 2 remains overall very close to the original game, down to certain dialogues being exactly the same. There are a few changes, however, and I agree with many when they say that some crucial words and lines and deliveries by voice actors just don't deliver as effectively as in the original. For example, I still don't understand why they removed a few words from the final letter.
These last few years since I became ill, I am so sorry for what I did to you, did to us.
I just hope the pain will end soon, so that you remember me for who I was, and not what the disease made me. I want you to go on.
It's more than just a different, less powerful voice acting. The rewriting here was conscious, and I really don't understand why they made the choice to remove the whole "I'm sorry" part. Really, something must have happened in the game's development here, but maybe we'll never know what exactly. There are a few other lines also not hitting as hard as in the original, often involving Maria's, but at the same time, I don't think these imperfections greatly reduce the overall quality of the writing and the storytelling. I have not observed changes that sugarcoated the story or changed the nature of what Silent Hill 2 was about. Visually, it's true some scenes and designs are a bit less erotic, let's say. Fair enough, although it didn't bother me too much because I always felt the sexual themes of Silent Hill 2 were more subliminal than the other themes such as sickness, guilt, and death. But more importantly, some things were improved in the writing. The side characters and their extra lines give much more depth to them. We see more of the sensitivity and broken innocence behind Angela. Eddie's increasingly paranoid and cold demeanor also transpires more from early scenes like in the theater, a place which, by the way, felt much darker than the bowling alley for this scene for some reason. Laura appears as much more endearing and likable behind her bratty attitude, which is an important aspect of the game when you consider that what Mary felt about Laura drives most of the plot and the narrative progression. Same for the conclusion of the story. When they decided to add new endings, they could have just gone for the trivia, fun, silly UFO type of Easter egg. But no, they also wrote the new ending Stillness, which I think is now my favorite ending. And it's hard, it's melancholic, it's ambiguous, it makes sense based on the entire story and experience we have just witnessed. And I wonder if it actually wasn't part of what Team Silent could have originally wanted to convey back in 2002 in their Water ending to begin with. The rewriting also doesn't lose the subtlety of the originals. It actually improves on the rare occasions when things didn't quite make sense. I'm getting a little bit into spoilers here about side characters, so skip this segment for about 30 seconds if you want. But an interesting difference with the original game is how after the boss fight with Eddie, James laments that he has just killed a human being. This line was removed from the remake and we just see James contemplating his hands and disbelief. A human being becomes just a trophy name in the remake. This choice makes a lot of sense plot-wise and is a very smart way to still acknowledge the original game's not always perfect writing. So overall, yes, there are some lines that are not as effective as in the original, just like there were lines in the original that weren't that well acted or integrated. So again, we find imperfections here and there, but I think that overall, especially for players who have never or haven't played the original game in a while, Silent Hill 2 Remake's writing still serves the story and its characters beautifully. Talking about characters, if there is one thing the remake does better than the original, it's the character design. I know I'm going to get roasted for this, but I don't care and hear me out. Every single character looks and feels exactly how they should. I know the original game is this untouchable classic, but let's remember that they had obvious technical limitations in the CGI, the graphics, the animations, and so on. I love the original game. It has been one of my most memorable gaming experiences ever, but the looks of some of its original characters never felt totally right for me either. For example, I never got how attractive Maria was supposed to be. And I was a teen. If there was a time when I could get excited over a few pixels, it was back then. But no, there was definitely something mysterious and otherworldly about her, which I liked, but I never found her features, face, and overall demeanor attractive. I also felt that Angela and Maria looked way too similar from one another. Skinny, square jawline, thin features. I just didn't get why these similarities since the characters themselves are so different. But the character design in the remake conveys exactly what it should have conveyed from the beginning. Maria doesn't wear an outfit as sexy as the original, which doesn't really matter. She's much sexier in the way she speaks and moves. The blue heaven scene? Wow, and I'm not a teen anymore. As for Angela, she actually looks her age. Angela was originally supposed to be 16 or 17 in the first game, and only was officially presented as being 19 because the voice actress used was older, according to the making of DVD that came with the game. And to be honest, she doesn't even look 19 in the original, but much older. So the softer, more juvenile and fragile look given to Angela in the remake not only makes sense because of this, but also because it allows her sudden outbursts and delusions to be all the more surprising to the player. Same for Eddie. He actually looks younger, and more importantly, he looks more like someone who was bullied and less like a bully himself. Eddie in the original game's graphics and CGI looked like a grown-up dressed in kid's clothes, and a grown-up that sometimes seemed too assertive given his background. When in fact, Eddie is supposed to be a kid who has just finished high school and who has been seen as too big and too ugly and was bullied because of it. The new design was much more effective in conveying not only this, but also, as I said earlier, the gradual progression of Eddie's paranoia. We can really see his mental state changing visually through his face and demeanor from the first to the final encounter we have with him. And I think this is shown much more efficiently thanks to the remake's graphics and character design. There's also the question of James' appearance. There was a lot of ruckus when the first trailer was shown about the fact that James looked too old, too rugged, a bit too charismatic too. And I agree, there's definitely something that was off in how James appeared in this first trailer. But what did Bloober do? They took into account feedback and found a better balance between the good rugged looks of voice actor Luke Roberts while smoothing out a little bit his traits to make James closer to the original rendition. An adult, definitely not a kid, but someone who is a little lost, a little broken, and definitely not an action hero. The voice acting of Luke Roberts is, by the way, phenomenal, much better than in the original game. Those little stutters hinting at the hesitation or confusion, or even the subconscious constraints that James feels when meeting the weird inhabitants of Silent Hill or discovering what happened to his wife, are spot on. The delivery of James' dialogues are a bit smoother than in the original, but without losing this weirdness, this impression that most of the discussions going on in this game are actually coming from another world and do not totally make sense. Again, it is the little imperfections that actually make this remake so loyal to the original intent and experience we felt 23 years ago. And what about the monsters and combats? Again, I think this remake did pretty much the best it was possible to do in order to not to lose sight of what Silent Hill 2 really was about. In some cases, changes to monsters were actually needed. And again, there is some criticism about combats, but I believe they actually make a lot of sense when we consider the game's lore and intended feel. I'll go back to this in a minute, but first let's talk about the monsters themselves. Masahiro Ito was involved in the remake, so their design really couldn't go wrong. The monster's original appearance remains barely touched on, it's still very loyal to the original, but the small details that have been improved on are very effective. Ito himself discussed this on Twitter a few days ago, and we can really see side by side how the new rendition, through new graphics and animations, make those creatures at once even more beautiful and frightening at the same time, without changing anything fundamental about them. However, what they did with new monsters and the bosses is amazing. Abstract Daddy's sheer size, movements, and level of details really make this encounter much more memorable and overwhelming than in the original game, and truly represent the weight this monster represents for Angela. Even a new boss altogether in Lakeview Hotel, a larger version of the Mandarin boss, made total sense too. The original game had abstract daddies roaming around, which felt definitely surprising and frightening, but also a bit off in terms of themes. But here it makes sense that a monster said, according to the Silent Hill 2 novel, to represent repressive thoughts and overwhelming guilt, would take a bigger role in Lakeview Hotel, James and Mary's special place. My favorite change was what Bloober and Ito did with mannequins. Turning them into spider-like creatures was not only extremely surprising and frightening, but allowed to mark a huge twist in the gameplay. When suddenly the prison becomes a place where you can get attacked from above, your entire approach to exploration and potential combats change and enhance the horror experience dramatically. Talking about combats, this was a tricky part to approach for this remake. Combats in the original game are not that easy. James' movements are limited and clunky, pushing you for the most part to avoid enemies at the beginning or to be very cautious with timing your attacks decently. Even secret weapons you can use in New Game Plus become worthless if you can't time your attacks correctly. The original game gets, however, much easier as soon as we get the handgun, and a regular playthrough will usually lead you to having more than enough ammunition by the end of the game. A similar experience is noticeable in the remake. With a new over-the-shoulder camera, it's normal that we would feel we have more control over combats. Just like Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake, here, too, this new gameplay obviously changes a lot the experience, but in my opinion, definitely for the better. Combats remain challenging during our first playthrough, and maybe I'm just bad at this, but I appreciated that it took a while for me to figure out and time my evades adequately for the different enemies. Also thanks to the little tweaks in the behavior of enemies when facing their otherworld versions. We also have many more moments in the game when we're facing more than one enemy at a time, unlike the original game. James, once again, is no superhero, but the sound effects and animations also make his movements and screams more gritty, more brutal, which to some extent makes sense as we realize he is indeed, in moments of despair, a man capable of violence. I don't know if you realize how much effort must have gone in designing combats for Silent Hill 2 Remake. I didn't find any concrete confirmation of this, but I already showed on Twitter during development how Bloober Team seems to have obtained funding for real research projects, in particular one running between December 2022 and November 2023, and valuing at more than $2 million. This project is called Development Work on an Innovative Combat System with Unique Components for Third-Person Perspective Games with a rich psychological horror narrative layer created using Unreal Engine 5 technology. The name is pretty self-explanatory, but here's how they describe the project more in detail. I quote, "The aim of this project is to create a playable prototype of interaction, fight, with unique opponents for the needs of third-person perspective games with a rich narrative layer, psychological horror, using Unreal Engine 5 technology. This will allow for automation, use of the possibility of modular construction and expansion, of the process of creating unique components in current and future games by developing a set of practices and tools that will serve as a basis for this type of scenarios at a world-class level." What this basically means is that Bloober Team acquired funding to make the most of their opportunity to work on Silent Hill 2 Remake in order to create from scratch an entire system they could use and build on for their future projects when it comes to combats. So what was at stake when designing combats in Silent Hill 2 Remake was more than just creating a good remake. It was setting up the entire future strategy as a game developer for combats in horror games. Combats which were, until Silent Hill 2 Remake, considered one of Bloober Team's weaknesses. I may get a bit nerdy about all of this, I know, but I really believe this is just one example of many other things we probably don't even realize when it comes to the efforts made by Bloober Team to produce a good remake. This is why I make these videos, by the way, so please consider giving a like and subscribe if you want more of that type of content. Now, one criticism people have made about the combats is how repetitive they can feel. I can understand this, especially from the second playthrough onwards, but I think there is enough diversity and flexibility for the players overall. And although there are limitations in how enjoyable or fun combats can be in Silent Hill 2 Remake, again, these imperfections actually make a lot of sense. The whole point of monsters in Silent Hill 2 is to remind James again and again of his guilt. They're products of his psyche. Every monster recalls the last moments of Mary. Every encounter recalls the long, tedious, horrible sickness that James had to witness. So that's why we only have a few different enemies, just like in the original game. As for combat moves, James is no superhero, so it makes perfect sense his range of action and ways to deal with combats is still very limited in a remake released in 2024. And since the monsters he encounters are offsprings of his own imagination, It also makes sense their movements are limited, too. Lying figures are by definition symbols of Mary's sickness and death, so limiting their main move to throwing up is logical. It wouldn't have made sense if Bloober tried to add too many things, losing sight of what these monsters represent for James. Again, is it a perfect experience in modern standards, like the ones we've seen in action horror remakes like Dead Space and Resident Evil 4 Remake? No. But when it comes to remaking the psychological horror of Silent Hill 2, I think this restraint works beautifully and should be recognized for what it is. So far, I focus on those three big pieces of criticism on Silent Hill 2 Remake: rhythm, characters, and combats. But we also hear a lot of things about much smaller nitpicky stuff. Let's take user interface. One debate we've seen a lot of recently is accessibility and how modern games and remakes tend to make things more obvious for the players on where to go, how to go about it, and so on. In terms of UI, yes, there are a few extra indicators than in the original by default, such as those white dots, whereas the original only had James' head movements for us to spot objects and things we could interact with. First of all, it is extremely customizable, so for those of you who complain that there's too much, there are very simple presets you can use that remove everything. But if you actually do so, instead of sticking to the default options of the remake, your experience will be less close to the one we had when playing the original game. Here's why. PlayStation 2 graphics, as good as they were for the original Silent Hill 2, still made it fairly simple to distinguish what was part of the background and what was an object you could interact with. In the remake, this distinction is impossible to mark purely visually because of how good graphics are for both background and interactable objects. In the remake, we still have James' head movements, which are still super important because the white dot only appears once we get close enough to an object. But once we're close, the white dot becomes important to confirm and to identify what exactly we can be interacting with, especially knowing that head movements, logically, are also dictated by how we move our camera, sometimes in directions opposite to the objects we are going to pick up. Same for the map, which remains very loyal to the spirit of the original game. No mini-map, more or less clear annotations made directly by James as we discover new clues and obstacles, no compass or obvious objectives we need to get to. The only addition I could note in the remake were related to clues for puzzles James would annotate in the map's margins. Did it make those puzzles easier? Not really. There's always a little twist, something new or different to uncover, pushing us to take the time to solve it, even if we had been through those puzzles multiple times in the original game. The jukebox forcing us to explore more of the town, or even the final question upon completing the coin cabinets, leaving us in doubt as to what actually will be the consequences until the very end of the game. So, for new and older players alike, puzzles weren't too difficult nor too simple, at least on normal mode, in my opinion, but, simply pretty close to the experience we had in the original game. In fact, the main moments when I got stuck in the remake were for the same reasons as in the original. I wasn't quite sure where to go and what to find. For example, I lost a lot of time in the hospital when I missed a breakable window that allowed me to access a room that I thought was completely closed off. It was frustrating, sure, but in the end quite close to what I had experienced a few years ago, even if done through slightly different mechanics. So overall, I don't find at all Silent Hill 2's user interface and puzzles inadequate. They remained extremely loyal, yet fresh enough, accurately transcribing how it was like to play those games back then, without making it discouraging for newer generations of players either. And finding such a balance is actually impressive. Now, so far I focused a lot on how the imperfections in both the original game and the remake actually made both games excellent. I just want to finish this video on some things that are simply perfect, precisely because Bloober, in discussion with members of the original Team Silent, thought very carefully about what to keep, how to keep it, and when to take some creative liberties. First of all, environments and visual direction are just phenomenal. There are places that strike beautifully this balance and weird paradox between beauty and desolation, so characteristic of what Silent Hill represents. Those unexplainable rust-colored walls or sheets covering the borders of Silent Hill, making it very unclear as to what really happened in this town. Light effects, as I already explained about the hospital, are not only beautiful, but actually have an enormous impact on the player's approach to environments they thought they knew. The final sequence in Lakeview Hotel leading to the final boss is, in this perspective, absolutely mind-blowing. A dreamlike scenery, beautifully wrapping up the entire progression of the game in what is truly a special place. Same with the strange wall in the labyrinth, a totally unique and new segment of the game that not only visually but also narratively pushes James further down into the nightmare this area is all about. The new over-the-shoulder camera obviously changes the visual identity of the game and how we apprehend the environments we explore, but the remake also keeps the very weird shots used in the original's cutscenes. This unique cinematography, although obviously departed from in many instances, makes regular comebacks to remind us that we are indeed witnessing the same experience as a few years ago. And don't even get me started with the sound design, it's just better than in the original. I mean, it followed up on what made the original so unique and so effective. A blend of screeching sounds and ambient noises, suddenly broken by beautiful melodies. An amazing use of silence, only broken by footsteps and the sound of James' radio. The loyal artistic vision behind the remake's sound design and music, made also possible through Yamaoka's involvement, is as effective as in the original game. But the use of modern technology make them all the more effective. 3D sounds, the PS5 controller's rendering of the radio, places like the prison, already among the creepiest places we visit in the original game, become even more terrifying in the remake, sometimes just based on sound design. Some of the main musical themes differ quite a bit from the original game, and it may not be to everyone's taste, especially if you have played the original soundtrack on loop for years like I did. Personally, I liked a little bit less the Laura's theme when the credits rolled. It felt not raw and melancholic enough, but that's actually secondary to what music in the original game was really about. Change the mood, mark a contrast, and convey something beautiful in the middle of extreme sadness. And it was really the only track I felt was better in the original. The others, like True, after James watches the videotape, or the theme when Angela walks in the staircase, or the music boxes in Lakeview Hotel, those themes are all timed perfectly and nicely rearranged for the remake. There is nothing to criticize about. The art direction is what made the original Silent Hill 2 so amazing back then, and I'm glad to see it's still there in the remake. I could go on and on about all of the things that were already perfect in the original game and kept very respectfully in the remake, but I've been going on for too long. For now, I think we should just acknowledge that Bloober Team did something incredible with Silent Hill 2 Remake. Is it a perfect game? No, but they took the best possible approach again and again when having to remake such an untouchable and memorable classic. Silent Hill 2 Remake, just like the original game, has its imperfections. But it is these imperfections that will, I hope, make it remembered as one of the best horror games and one of the best video game remakes made in recent years. And I don't think I'm going too far when I say that Bloober Team's efforts surpass the work of Capcom on their remakes of the first 4 Resident Evil games. I'm not saying that Silent Hill 2 Remake is necessarily better than its Resident Evil counterparts, which are amazing remakes in horror games, as I explained at length in another video, but I think Bloober had a much harder task ahead of them given the complexity and ambiguity of its source material. And they pulled this through beautifully.